I hate to be kind of doomsday, but when you look at the reality of certain metrics, such as the United States debt, such as what the Fed is doing with quantitative easing infinity, such as the interventions in the repo market. Dollar funding market. So it's really kind of the plumbing of the financial system. It's called the repo market, or one of the components of it, the largest component. So that really started to have problems back in September, in the middle of September. And then when you layer that over the issues we've had with COVID, and the Fed was committing, they weren't doing, but they're committing to $1 trillion a day in the repo market. I mean, just numbers that are astronomical. It's tough to get your mind around. So when you see them intervening so much into a very complex system, it never ends well. And I look at economics in our economy a lot like nature. And we instinctively know that when man tries to come in and fiddle around with nature, I always use the example of, Florida's having an insect problem. So they bring in all these frogs that eat the insects. And the next thing you know, they've got a frog problem that's 10 times bigger than the original insect problem. We as human beings, we just can't get our mind around all of the variables that go into nature, the weather, things like this. But our economy is the exact same thing. It's a complex system that's really built on quite literally billions of transactions per day. And we cannot micromanage it. And like nature, usually what happens when we try to kind of twist this dial and turn that dial, the net result is a lot worse than where we started. Now, sometimes we're able to kick the can down the road, and you've got a period, kind of like a grace period. And I think we've been in that period of time since 2008, and during the GFC until now. And you look back at the headline numbers during that time, and unless you really peel back the layers of the onion, it looks pretty good. And we had unemployment rate down 3-4%, almost at all-time lows. The stock market was at all-time highs. I mean, just look at Trump's Twitter feed. He'll tell you that on an hourly basis. According to him, we've got the greatest economy of all time of human history. It's almost like comical watching him really over-promote it. But if you start to really look at the fundamentals and you see that the economy that we had and still have, and even more so today, is built on asset prices, debt, and confidence, you're like, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with fundamentals. And that's when you start to realize that in the future, and it could be tomorrow, it could be 10 years, but at some point in time, we're going to have to pay the fiddler. You have to look back and see from an economic output standpoint, how much did we drop in 2008? We all lived, or most of us lived through that, so we kind of understand, even if you were young at the time, that it hit the fan pretty hard. And we're on the brink of having some serious problems long term. So if you look at how much economic output decreased in 2008, it went down by about 6%. So call it from 100% down to 94%. And to give that some context, back in the Great Depression of the 1930s, economic output went down by about 25%. And we know that created a decade that most people say we only got out of by World War II. I would disagree with that, but it produced a lot of pain for a long time. So you look at where we are today with COVID, and you say, okay, well, what would the economic ramifications be if the Fed wouldn't have come in, or if the government wouldn't have created $3 trillion the Fed actually monetized it, but if the government would have spent, let's say, $3 trillion into the economy to quote unquote stimulate, and the demand side would have gone down. I mean, even with that $3 trillion of stimulus, and they'll probably do more, we can safely assume, just by looking around at all your friends that have lost jobs and all the businesses that are closed up and most likely won't come back, some will, but not all of them, we could say, okay, we're maybe at 50% right now. I think, in fact, for the last quarter, GDP went down by about that number. But so say that annually we go down by 25% of economic output. Okay, we're in a Great Depression right there. So what's keeping us from, being in an kind of an economic whirlwind that would be even worse than that? It's just the Fed monetizing the deficits of the government. So, and I know that kind of gets a little wonky as far as the terms, but what that means is the government issues treasuries at auction, and that's where they're getting the money they need to spend. Now, technically, it doesn't really work that way, but that's the easiest way to think of it. I know if we got some people that are big into MMT, they're saying, oh, that's not the way it works, George, and trust me, I get it, but I'm just explaining it this way because it's the easiest for the layperson to understand. So they issue the treasuries, and normally what would happen is people like you or I, with savings, or foreigners who have produced goods that we consume here in the United States and have got those little green pieces of paper through the trade deficit, they're going to buy those treasuries or those assets. And then so the government spends the money, so it's the same money supply that's circulating. Now what happens is if the government runs these massive deficits, there's just not enough buyers, or the interest rates would go way up. So the Fed steps in and buys the treasuries from the government. Now they do this in like kind of a shell game with the primary dealers, because technically the Federal Reserve Act prevents them from buying this stuff directly, but it's just kind of a wink and nod thing. So the primary dealer buys it and they just flip it right to the Fed really quick. So what ends up happening are these treasuries go onto the Fed's balance sheet. Well, how do they pay for that? The Fed has to literally print new money, or they have to create new electronic money out of nowhere. So they buy that from the primary dealer, and they just add an additional 1 billion in digits, just with a stroke of a computer. And those that $1 billion goes into the bank account. We call it the reserve account that the bank has with the Federal Reserve. That it just adds that $1 billion to their account. So they're just creating money out of nowhere. Usually that doesn't get into the real economy directly, because that's just, I don't want to get too technical here, but it just gives the bank the ability to create more loans. And if they were to create more loans, then it would affect the actual money that was circulating. But when the government does this and the Fed monetizes their debt, which means, again, basically they print up money, bank reserves, to buy these treasuries, the government takes the money and spends it into the real economy. So this directly affects the amount that's in circulation, chasing the same amount of goods and services. The problem we have right now is the amount of goods and services that we have in the economy is shrinking dramatically for obvious reasons. People aren't going to work, and if they're not going to work, they're not creating the stuff. And we're still able to import a lot, but you've got this contraction. Now, generally, you would have the demand side go down as well. If everyone's staying at home, they're not spending money, they're not working, so they have a lot less money. But what's happened to the stimulus is the government has given them kind of this bridge loan, if you will, but it's not really a loan. It's just, you don't have to pay it back. So what we found is that the average incomes in a lot of categories over the past, call it 2 or 3 months, have actually increased in the United States, although unemployment, the headline number is, I don't know, maybe it's around 10% right now, but if you really dive into unemployment, it's closer to 20%. So we've got unemployment at 20% while incomes have actually gone up. But this is a result of that debt monetization or additional money printing. Then it just goes back to, kind of the basic economics, where if you've got a greater and greater supply of currency units that are chasing the same amount of goods and services, if not less goods and services, then you most likely get consumer price inflation. And not all, and you could see asset deflation, you could have some prices go down, but the majority of the prices of the stuff you and I buy daily, those prices go up. So there's never a free lunch. At some point, you've got to rob Peter to pay Paul. And if we're printing up these currency units out of nowhere that we didn't produce any stuff to actually get, then the people who are going to be paying the price are going to be the savers and the people who most likely go into the market, because this creates a higher propensity for this boom bust cycle that just sucks in the average investor at the top. It always works that way in any bubble. You know, we see the people taking the stimulus going into their Robinhood accounts and buying bankrupt companies like Hertz. You don't see that at the bottom in the start of a bull market. You see that at the top of a bull market. And unfortunately, you know, we as human beings, we get emotional. I believe the market hurts the most amount of people possible. It just sits there and waits till everyone's on one side of the boat, and then bam, it flips it over. And those are the people that will have to pay the price. Fortunately, there's people like you and others out there that are kind of saying, hey guys, look at this, so we can prepare more people. They can understand how this works so they don't fall into that trap and get hurt long-term financially.